Hey folks, greetings from the Offensive Security Group here at Secure IT 360, coming at you with a new episode of the Cyber Threat Perspective. Today I've got none other than Darrius again with me, who's one of the pen testers on the team. And we have a wonderful, exciting episode all about Active Directory security risks from a hacker's perspective. So it's kind of a mouthful, but Darrius, thanks for hopping on and talking about some more hackery stuff with us.
Yeah, thanks for having me back. It's always a pleasure.
Yeah, I'm excited. So the title of this episode alludes to, we're going to be talking about Active Directory. Now, Active Directory, as we all know, is a vital component to your infrastructure, to your organization, to your firm, right? It's the central hub for managing user accounts and computers and servers, group policies, and all that stuff, right? I'm sure everybody who's listening to this probably has some familiarity with Active Directory. You're probably in charge of administering it, securing it, those of you who are listening. Unfortunately, many times, as we see on internal pen tests and security assessments and all things in between, it's commonly misconfigured. There's commonly vulnerabilities that are inherent to Active Directory. And so we're going to be kind of taking a unique approach to exploring this a little bit in depth. And kind of what I want to do, and Darrius and I want to do, is talk about some of these security risks in Active Directory and talk about them not just from a theory or from an academic perspective, but talk about how a threat actor would abuse it or how threat actors are abusing those things. Talk about how you can kind of mitigate those things, close those gaps, implement additional monitoring for things, and more or less just help you identify these things in your environment that you might have and how to mitigate them, detect them, and ultimately stop bad things from happening in your environment, right? So that's kind of the goal of this episode. Darrius, anything you want to lead off with to start?
Yeah, I think the only other thing I will add is I think we're also going to keep it focused right now to just on-prem AD.
Yep.
I know there's Azure AD. I know, in fact, Microsoft, you can even do your AD in the cloud now as a whole completely separate service, which is pretty cool. But as
Google too. I don't know if you saw.
Really?
Google.
Okay.
Yeah, Google now has managed Active Directory. We should do an episode on that. We should explore it a little bit because they just announced it a few weeks ago, I think.
So they dropped Google domains, but now they're like, hey, you can manage your domain with us.
I know, right? Here's all these new domains. Oh, by the way, we're gonna send it to whatever that website was. So we're gonna be talking about on-prem Active Directory as we all know and love, and not on Azure or Azure Active Directory. And I think the common phrase for Azure is Azure Active Directory is neither Azure nor Active Directory, is what I commonly hear people talking about it as.
It's a whole other thing, and I think it definitely warrants its whole dedicated episode for sure.
Yeah, and we'll definitely talk about Azure AD in the future. So the first kind of category here that I want to talk about was legacy protocols. Now, probably the most famous example of this is WannaCry. If y'all remember WannaCry, an SMB worm, SMB vulnerability, that was pretty prolific. If you remember all of the hysteria around that exploited a flaw in SMB1, and so SMB1 has been deprecated for a while now. It's very insecure. It's not recommended to be used, and
it's 30 years old, right? It's 30 plus.
Yeah. But interestingly, we still see it on enabled in environments for backwards compatibility, because there's environments still running Server 2003 and Server 2008, believe it or not, running legacy applications that rely on older versions of SMB. So that's the first one. Is it's a pretty low-hanging fruit change. Most modern organizations probably won't have a lot of trouble disabling SMB1. However, I do say that with a grain of salt, right, Darrius? With nothing we say here is just just go disable the checkbox or check the checkbox and your problems are solved. It's not that simple, right?
Yeah, and I think the biggest issue with SMB is the fact that you can pretty much there are compensating controls you could put in place, right? But the biggest thing is you can still very much have data transmitted in clear text even with those mechanisms in place, and that's the big reason why you don't want to use it.
Yep. Yeah, and there's no signing. The security controls in SMB1 are very weak, right? There's no signing in SMB1, which means that you can take an NTLM hash and you can relay that hash, pass that hash, and achieve access to another system, right? Use it for lateral movement using SMBv1 because it's enabled. So inherently weak protocol. There are a ton. I don't want to say a ton. That might be misleading. There's good resources on the internet for tackling this, right? Along with the other protocols that we're going to talk about. So if you have things like SMB1, LMNR, NBNS, MDNS, NTLM v1, LM, there's resources online. If you go and you look for how to disable those things, there's people that have talked about doing it before in their environments. So I encourage people that are listening to go seek those out. But like we were saying before, there's not, as far as I know, there's not like a one-stop shop for like, hey, go to this website. It's going to tell you how to disable all your legacy protocols and like you're good. I don't believe that to exist. This is a hard thing to do. It's time consuming, but it definitely is worthwhile.
Agreed, especially with NTL MV1. Like that's one that I've seen in a couple different environments. It's hard to just be able to turn it off. It's like playing whack-a-mole. There's always there's always something. But to kind of shift it back, right, to more of a hacker perspective, right? So let's say you're doing an internal, and you notice that these legacy protocols are in use. Spencer, what's what are your next steps? What goes on in your head?
Yeah, for sure. And this goes with every internal. We'll look for LMNR, link local multicast name resolution, which is a precursor to DNS, right? And so if you don't have DNS configured in your environment, you could fall back to LMNR. And with LMNR, you can essentially man in the middle of the traffic. You can spoof the traffic, and you can capture hashes that way. So me as an attacker or a bad guy, if I'm on a network, there's security tools that you can run like Responder or Inve that can get in the middle of that traffic, intercept it, spoof the requests, and capture NTLM hashes, NTLM v1 hashes if they're enabled, NTLM v2 hashes, Kerberos tickets, all things like that. So if I'm an attacker, I can use that to my advantage to capture hashes that I can then, take offline and try and crack them with a password cracker. Or if, like we were talking about a few minutes ago with SMB, if there's weak SMB controls in the environment, I could then potentially take those hashes and send those to another computer to allow me to log into that computer. It's called relaying. So I take a hash that I've obtained from one system, I send it over here to the other one, and then I log in with that hash, that NTLM hash. So that's kind of what I see as being an attack, or one of the methods of attack to these protocols is capturing, relaying, or capturing and cracking, because these are inherently weak protocols.
And I'll say, we're saying all of this, and it, on the surface level, it sounds very technical and impressive, but I think one of the cool for us, but also, as if you're, a system admin somewhere, the scary thing about it is it's not a hard thing to do. Especially if you don't have other, controls in place. If your EDR solution, if you don't have an EDR solution in place, or if the one you have isn't, up to snuff, they're literally script. It's go to GitHub and then pull it down and then run it. Like it's not. It's super technical, deep thing.
Yeah, it's not, the nitty gritty of the NTLM protocol and like authentication, Windows internals, super technical stuff, right? But like you're saying, if you do want to learn how this technique works, I would recommend Heath Adams' Practical Ethical Hacking course on YouTube. His course on YouTube will walk you through this exact attack chain where you run a tool called Responder, you capture the hash, and then you relay it with something called NTLM Relay X. And that's a whole thing. You can go look at it for free on YouTube and kind of learn how that attack works. You could reproduce it in your environment and then, learn how to detect that. So really good way to kind of learn how that's done and how that can be abused. And what an attacker might do with those protocols enabled in an environment. Yeah. So, in terms of advice, right, Darius? Obviously, our advice is, disable legacy protocols, but at a broader level, run some of these tools in your environment. I would encourage people to run some of these tools in your environment and see what they look like. See if there's ways you can detect those with your current security tools, right? A lot of these tools will leave a signature. They'll leave some sort of artifact either on the network or on the endpoint or something like that you can use to detect. And then, build out kind of your monitoring from that as well. So that's something I recommend as well is, fix these things, but also learn how to identify them as well.
Oh, for sure. And I'll also add, before we move on to the next thing, fixing it may not always be easy, but some progress is always better than none. So even if you disable it in the majority of your environment, but there's still a few places where you have to have it.
Yep.
That's improvement.
Yep.
And so definitely want to encourage everyone. Small. How to eat an elephant one bite at a time.
Exactly. And it, progress is made by doing, not by thinking about it. So exactly what you said, Darius, is just little improvements every day. Even if it's just, this isolated thing, like an AS400, for example, maybe you can isolate that in its own network or DMZ or something, and you can kind of reduce a lot of that risk. So very good point.
Oh yeah. So then, I guess to say, if you're going to tackle it, the first step is identifying, right? Like identify everywhere it's being used first. And then, that makes the next part so much easier.
Yeah. It goes back to the CIS controls, right? Like step number one is, inventory. What assets do I have? What software do I have? That goes with protocols too, right? What protocols do I have enabled in my environment? What legacy protocols are enabled? And Elminar, NBNS, MDNS, those can all be used to abuse, the network quite heavily, and that's something we look for quite often.
And could be your excuse to get rid of that legacy application that you just despise because no one else, you're supposed to support it. And the guy who wrote it, or the guy or gal who wrote it, is no longer there. So it's just like, hey, there's your excuse right there.
Yep. There's no better time to rip that thing out than now. You know what they say, the first best time was yesterday, the second best time is now, or whatever that saying is.
Yeah. So next we have a little bit of Kerber roasting, right? Like that's the next kind of big thing as far as fortifying AD, right?
Yeah, so Kerber roasting can be a pretty quick win for an attacker, right? And Kerber roasting is essentially stealing hashes from accounts that have a service principal name, so an SPN configured on them. A lot of times we see that there's dormant accounts or accounts that are not used anymore that still have SPNs configured that we could potentially obtain. But essentially, if you're using a weak password for that service account and we're able to Kerber roast it, capture that hash, there's a pretty good chance we're going to be able to crack that password. Like if it's 8 to 10 characters and it's a fairly weak password, it's pretty much guaranteed to be cracked. Like if it's around 8 to 10, you can pretty much guarantee that thing's going to get cracked with fairly little effort, right? So that is, like I said, it's a very low-hanging fruit kind of thing. It should be, relatively simple to remediate that. In that, just make sure all the passwords are long. Like service account passwords, Darius. I don't know what you commonly recommend. What do you recommend people have for service account passwords, like in terms of length or?
Okay, so I mean, I would say probably, at least 12 plus characters. But I think what's more important, and this is the thing that most people don't do with their service accounts, is you should rotate them. Regardless of length, I think keeping them rotated is gonna, that's the extra step that I really think helps prevent, a lot of potential, or helps to reduce risk a lot.
And you can do that with a PAM solution, or privileged access management system, or PIM, privileged identity management. XYZ buzzword. There's tools out there that can help you rotate those automatically. I always recommend if it's not like an interactive login type of account, like an admin account, I always recommend just set it as long as possible, right? 30 characters, 50 characters, whatever you can possibly set it to that is going to fit your system and your environment. Those service accounts, you should never have to log in with them or type the password in more than the first time. So I always recommend clients when I see those on internals with weak passwords, I say just set those as long as possible. Change them once a year or something if you want. Set those as long as possible. And then if it is an admin account that has an SPN, right? First of all, you probably don't want to have SPNs on admin accounts. Like your admin accounts should be admin accounts, right? Where you log in and perform administrative duties. The service accounts should be service accounts, right? So there's a lot there to unpack in terms of like admin accounts, account tiering. We could have a whole podcast, Darrius, on, like least privilege, account tiering, and that whole thing. But I think that's, like you said, one of the most important things is making that password long, rotating it, is on a certain interval, and ensuring those passwords are strong.
I would also even say to your point about, asking yourself before the service account even gets created, does it need interactive login? And if it doesn't, go ahead and set the policy so that it can't. I think that's another thing that we often see, get missed. And then most importantly, making sure you have detections for your service account. I'm going to try to keep it strictly on-prem, not necessarily Azure AD, but having rules and logic set up to say, wait a minute, it's really weird that this account that normally on a consistent basis only operates on these particular endpoints or servers, we now see it logged in or it performed action on this server. That's one of those things that should raise a red flag.
Yep. Something I do in internals, on an internal pen test, we're time limited, right? We only have a certain amount of time, a few days, a week, 2 weeks, whatever it is. We might not have the time to look at the accounts and kind of look for canary tokens or look for honey accounts, right? Or be stealthy, in certain ways. So a lot of times I just Kerberos the entire domain, right? Like I'll just Kerberos everything and I'll pull down what I can get. And one of the ways, attackers know this too, and that's common for attackers to do as well, is they'll Kerberos everything, pull the hashes down. A good way to detect this is with a honey token, a canary account or a honey account, whatever you want to call it, so that if you do see that account get Kerberosed, something strange is going on. And there's more advanced stuff you can do with that. And like you said, Darrius, I also would recommend setting the logon rights for those accounts so they can't interactively log in, time of day restrictions if you want, all sorts of stuff. The other thing with this is, the reason that attackers are going after these accounts and Kerberosing these accounts is many times we see service accounts in highly privileged groups, right? Like how many times have we seen a SQL admin, service account that is just a member of domain admins, right? It's just easier to give it all the permissions possible than to restrict it. But you kind of end up shooting yourself in the foot because if somebody does get access to that, they've got all the keys to the kingdom at that point.
For sure.
So file shares.
It's the fun one.
I think this is one of my favorites because it's very low tech. Like out of all of, the attacker techniques and stuff like that, spelunking through the file shares is the most low tech, insulting thing you can do, right? We look at, the breaches like Uber, Okta, and like you name it. Pretty much all those big breaches, you could probably tie back to some sort of sensitive credential material in a file share somewhere.
Oh, yeah. It works. It's kind of sad, but it's true. Why Kerberos when you can just open up a file share and type in password.
Yep, and a typical on-prem AD environment, right, Darrius? Most users have access to most of the file shares. There's probably some restrictions going on, and I'm seeing that more and more as we do these pen tests. Is that hey, you should be very restrictive in your file shares and not put all of your IT admin stuff in a share that's readable by everyone. Review the share permissions, things like that. But this is a gold mine for attackers because there is sensitive files there. There's probably script files with passwords in them.
Yep.
There are deployment tools there. If you're using something like WSUS to do updates, or using SCCM to distribute applications and update those applications, a lot of times that SCCM share, the deployment share, will be misconfigured. So there's a lot here, and I think we can kind of loosely tie this into least privilege, right? Like least privilege, what would you say?
So I would say that. I also wanted to add, I think one thing that we've seen recently, and it makes sense, completely makes sense, is double check your logon scripts, and like it's something it's like all you're trying to do is have certain drives getting mapped to certain users, and that's awesome. But the folder where the logon scripts are used, a lot of times are just left, like you said, they're left completely wide open. Any authenticated user has access to that, to that folder. And so I think that's one just completely easy win right there, is making sure that you're auditing it. I think I've mentioned this on a couple other podcasts of like, I think it's really interesting. Like we talk about secure code from we always think of like developers, and it's just like, oh, you got to make sure you leave credentials out of your code. Well, the same principles a lot fall on the infrastructure and your sysadmin guys as well.
Mm-hmm.
Don't put credentials in your scripts. There are tons of ways to programmatically pull what you need when you need it. But still pretty much on about 80% of the internals that you get to, you find a PowerShell script, you find a batch file or something like that, you're going to get clear text credentials, right? So that's something that I kind of want to encourage. The infrastructure guys who watch our stuff is, try to make that move towards getting that out of your scripts. It makes a huge difference.
Yep. Yeah. And also inspect what you expect kind of thing. More often than not, when I see stuff like that, it's like, oh, the clients, it was a mistake. I forgot to remove that or something. It's like they're doing it out of convenience, which is fine. Like we all do that stuff, right? But then they get busy, they forget. And then before you know it, it's, gone from their mind because they're doing 100 other things. And now there's a deployment script out there that they didn't really, they knew it wasn't a good idea to keep it there, but they just forgot because they got busy. So that is very common too. So the remedy of that is to develop some sort of process where you're reviewing those on a regular basis, right? Write a PowerShell script to search for specific keywords in your file shares, or get a tool to help you do it, or, have us pen test and we'll find it. No, but seriously, like write a script, do some automation, regularly review those, because you'll be surprised how much low-hanging fruit is out there that you didn't know was out there, especially if you have any kind of size IT department, right? If it's not just you and, one or two other people, you'd be surprised what is left out there.
And I think that'd be a great project for any of these companies. If you have an intern, that's a pretty solid project, like, hey, go out and find, all the credentials that are in our file share. Great intern project that also, it's helpful, but also, probably something that you probably don't want your some of the main team to kind of work on because they're busy tackling other stuff.
And by the way, it's not just file shares, right? We're talking SharePoint, OneDrive, Dropbox, Box. Oh, and by the way, if you're a law firm, your document management system, iManage or NetDocs, all of those things are ripe for people storing that kind of information in there. And it's not just IT information either, right? We'll get access to a DMS, for example, on an internal pen test, and we'll search for the word password, and we find, Susie in accounting's password file that has her Amazon password, her Apple ID, her social security number, her credit card, all of her personal information, because it's just easier to store it there. It's a safe place. They know where to find it. But taking a proactive approach and looking for that stuff ahead of time can really save you a headache down the road.
For sure.
Oh, and talking about GPOs real quick, or logon scripts. You mentioned logon scripts. I meant to mention. I'm currently writing a script. I'm right now. I'm calling it Script Sentry, and what it does is it
Great
goes
name.
to it goes to the logon share, like sysvol logon scripts, right? It parses all of the logon scripts. It looks for certain keywords like net use. You know, you can map a share net use, and then you put in credentials. It looks for files that are referenced within those login scripts. And it's also going to eventually look at group policies that are deploying files to look for misconfigured files. Because something I notice a lot of times is there'll be a logon script, right, that maps a share or maps, a drive with a specific explicit credential, or it will download or copy a file locally, right? Or execute some MSI or something like that that's located in a network share. Well, what I was seeing a lot of times was they would, the logon script would be running some MSI that's on a network share. In that network share, that MSI in the network share has misconfigured permissions such that I, as a regular user, can just replace that MSI with my own, right? So now I have code execution on every machine just because I can, modify this MSI file.
Yep.
So I'm writing a tool now to kind of do some of this cool stuff and kind of highlight it and identify it and exploit that stuff. I'm calling it Script Sentry, but that is very common too.
Agreed. Yeah, I mean, it's one of the it's once again, it's one of those things where it's really easy when you think about it. It's like, oh, duh, but it has impact. Sometimes it's just as easy as, oh, look, there's a logon script called IT admins. All right,
Yep.
add this account to the domain admin group.
Yep.
And you just wait.
Yep. And when a threat actor gets on your network, if they're not initially caught, right? If they're not initially found out, if they're kind of sitting there laying dormant, they're persisted, and they're not making a lot of noise, they're going to be poking around. They're going to be looking for credentials. They're going to be looking for ways to get some level of admin permissions in the environment, and that's a very common place that they're going to look. And so that, to kind of tie it back to the hacker approach, that's why that's so important. We spend so much time on that.
Sure.
Local admins is next. So something that we see is pretty common, right? Is we'll get access to a machine in an environment, and once that host is compromised, if we're not initially detected, if there's no alarm bells going off, a lot of times we find out we're a local admin, right? Because it's just easier that way. And firms are getting a lot better at this. They're implementing laps or they're using other tools. But a key kind of mistake is just having everyone be a local administrator on their workstation, right, Darrius?
Which is, that is a tough fight, because you're exactly right. Right? Not everyone should be local admin. That's just point blank, right? But at the same time, I feel, because I know how office politics a lot of times can beat all. So it's tough, because how do you tell the CEO of the company, hey, you don't need local admin rights on your own computer?
Mm-hmm.
That can be a tough sell.
Yeah.
And so, I know a lot of companies are kind of struggle with that. I will say, though, that there are, once again, doing a little bit is better than nothing, right? So you may not be able to strip it from everyone, right? But if you can strip it from maybe the majority, and then there are controls you can put in place to still allow end users to do what they need to do, right? There's Make Me Admin and a plethora of other tools that allow someone to temporarily become admin, local admin, and even includes, a lot of them even include auditing and the ability to, your support team to say yay or nay, right? So there are definitely ways to do it while also having that middle ground of allowing end users to, not be affected too much. But no, for sure. Not everyone, if everyone in the company has local admin rights, you're asking for a bad time once at least someone gets popped.
Yep. Yeah. And, in some ways, I'm kind of on two sides of the coin with this argument, right? One is, yes, don't let anybody have local admins. There's ways to restrict it. There's, identity products that can help you audit that. And, they'll have like a UAC prompt, and you have to give a reason, or you have to select a reason, and if you don't select the right one, it's it's either denied or the IT department has to approve it. And there's things like that work out well. Application control is an important control in this too. So there's a lot of things tie into this, but I'm kind of torn because on one hand, it's a good recommendation. It's a good strategy to not have everyone be local admin. But on the other hand, there's so many local privilege escalation exploits. There's so many ways to elevate privileges just because of the way Windows is, that I'm like, does it even matter? Right. And I'm like torn because there's just so many ways that you can elevate to like system, or to, and many times you might not even need local admin rights. A threat actor might not, right? It's common that they're going to try to get local admin so they can dump credentials, but a skilled adversary is likely not going to need local admin rights to accomplish their goals. So I'm a little bit torn on that, but just because it's not abused, just because it's not like a core component to an attack chain doesn't make it not a relevant security control, right? If that makes sense.
No, so yeah, I'm personally along the lines of, for sure, right? It's definitely possible to where you may not even need local admin rights, right? And there are a plethora of ways to get it. I think it's just about not making it easy on the threat actor, so, everybody having local admin rights it's very much like, oh, well, that's easy, it's more, you now have more options right off the bat versus if you can eliminate that, like, are there other alternatives? For sure. Is it a silver bullet solution? Not at all. But I do think you increase your chances of potential detection, right? So if I maybe, I'm a threat actor and I need local admin rights in order to do the thing I want to do, you now have more chances of catching me because now I have to, exploit some vulnerability to get that. And that's just, more opportunity for your SOC to find me.
Yeah. And that's something we tell clients all the time is that's why we have layered controls. Is the more steps that you make a threat actor take, the more noise they have to make, which means the greater the chance that we have to detect them, like you said. And there's probably a certain amount of survivorship bias too with that, like all things in security. The last one on our list is least privilege. This kind of tied into kind of all of these. So it's kind of a little bit of a bow that we'll put on it. But essentially, when you're talking about Active Directory is an identity-based platform, right? You have objects that are ultimately identities, right? You have computers, servers, workstations. You have these objects, and these objects have security permissions, right? They have ACLs, access control lists, and they're all configurable. So a good recommendation to kind of mitigate a lot of the stuff that we just talked about is to review those on a regular basis. One of my favorite tools, and it's absolutely free, is Pingcastle. Pingcastle will find pretty much everything that we talked about, except for the file share thing. Pingcastle will probably find 99% of what we just talked about in this episode, and it's completely free. You can download it, run it in your environment on a regular basis. It's got it's got a nice report. It looks really cool, and you can track things over time, report on it, and all that good stuff. But that can help you find a lot of this low-hanging fruit and mitigate it. And there's other tools out there, but I think the key point is least privilege, restrict to only what you need or what those accounts need to do their job, and review it on a regular basis.
For sure. Yeah, I think like you said, reviewing and auditing, that's the key. I think a lot of organizations that we come across aren't doing that. I think they set it up they set things up one time and they just set it and forget about it. And this is where, change management, all the buzzwords come into play. It's better for you to know about it prior to and to take care of it, even before you even have a pen test. Like if you have a pen test, ideally, yes, the person performing it is going to find all this stuff. And that's great. But why give them the easy win? Why give us the easy win, right? So like if you're doing that continuously, it not only makes our jobs harder, but it makes the threat actors' jobs harder as well. So,
and I think the publicity of the breaches, and the last thing I'll say before we wrap up is, I think the publicity that a lot of these data breaches have been getting recently. I think there's been more and more in the news lately, more information, more understanding, maybe. Higher profile things. I think we're starting to understand a little bit as a community, as an industry, just how threat actors are working. And that's partly why we do pen tests, so we can help educate the clients that we work with of, hey, here's how an attacker might attack this thing or this network. Here's what you can do about it. But the last thing I'll say is it's kind of cliche, but think like a bad guy. Like if I'm going to rob a bank, how might I do it? Or if I'm going to try and break into this network, or if I'm going to try and do something on the network, how might somebody do it, without your knowledge, right? Or your environment the best. So how would somebody go about abusing things in your environment that would be hard for you to know about, right? And start thinking about those things and kind of implement some processes to review those things and look at those things and shore those things up.
Agreed.
All right, so that's all we have time for today. I hope you all enjoyed that. I hope that was a good discussion for you all. I hope that you took away something from that. If you did, leave us a note in the comments or send us a message, or do whatever the social media people do, stuff and things. All the like, subscribe, following, sharing with your community helps us reach more people, helps us kind of get the word about what we're doing, sharing our wisdom and entertainment, hopefully. But if you enjoyed this episode, you can find us at offsec.blog and at secureIT360.com. We have new episodes every Wednesday, so we'll see you next time.